President Biden is asking Congress to approve $33 billion to support Ukraine against Russia. That's in addition to the $13.6 billion approved in March. As the war in Ukraine continues with no end in sight, the Biden administration is seeking to provide more equipment, weapons, and aid to the Ukrainian government.
The cost of this fight is not cheap, but caving to aggression is going to be more costly if we allow it to happen. We either back Ukrainian people as they defend their country, or we stand by as the Russians continue their atrocities and aggression in Ukraine.
The latest funding request intends to support Ukraine's defense for the next 5 months. It will supply about $20 billion in military defense equipment and weapons, $8.5 billion in economic assistance to the Ukrainian government, and $3 billion in humanitarian aid. Congressman Louis Gohmert held a press conference to strike Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which offers protection to internet companies from being sued based on the content that is published, so long as everyone retains the right to post to those platforms. In recent years, not everyone has retained that right, and YouTube and other big tech companies have censored free speech under the guise of being responsible to the public. We had a chance to ask Congressman Gohmert what about Section 230 has him most concerned.
Well, in 1996, I understand Congress is concerned, fledgling companies trying to get going, making use of this thing called the internet, it will be referred to later as social media. I understand the concern, but Section 230 was poorly written and has been poorly interpreted in such a way that it gives immunity to private companies for taking away First Amendment freedom of speech rights. And I do understand the libertarian part of me says you shouldn't be able to tell a private company who they can have on their media and who they do not. However, in this case, where Congress gave them immunity, Congress does not even have authority to abrogate, take away somebody's First Amendment free speech rights. And yet, it's been interpreted now to mean that the social media, private companies, can take away Americans' free speech rights, and they cannot be sued for it. Well, Congress can't do that. Therefore, they can't give that right to a company when they don't have that right. So it's been interpreted in such a way that it's got to fall. And I know there are some members of Congress that think, well, let's just tweak it a little bit. And I'm telling you, I don't believe it can be adequately tweaked.
What do you say to the folks out there, your fellow members of Congress that may say, we just had a big victory for free speech with Musk taking over Twitter and may not put this in a priority that you think it should?
People's right to their First Amendment free speech should not be dependent on somebody getting the financial wherewithal to buy a company that's been given governmental special protection. It shouldn't take that. Either the Congress should strike down 230 or the federal justice system should do that. So we're looking for the federal judicial system, take it down.
The ins and outs when it comes to Section 230 can be complicated and convoluted, which is part of the reason why it is yet to be resolved. Rachel Brevard is senior tech columnist at The Federalist, and we spoke with her earlier to get some clarity. Rachel Brevard, thank you so much for joining us in the Capitol Report.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Rachel, with the liberation of Twitter dominating the headlines, I just want to get your thoughts about Section 230. I guess just very basic, how are these big tech companies shielded by Section 230?
So Section 230, as originally envisioned when it was passed in 1996, was designed to protect the companies from being sued for any content posted by their users. It was designed to clean up the internet, if you can believe it. That was the original intent of the law. It was designed to, again, encourage companies to remove the things people don't want to see. The pornography, the smut, the harassing lascivious content that people don't want, while at the same time promoting as the law says, quote, a diversity of views. Now, what has happened over time is that the courts have stretched this provision of law, which is pretty small, it's only 26 words, into a bulletproof shield, protecting these companies when they sort of censor and curate all kinds of content in a way that a lot of First Amendment actors are not protected, right? Social newspapers, movie companies, they don't have the same protection that these social media giants have. So the original intent of the law, I think, was probably a good one, but it has evolved in such a way that it has made these companies almost immune to any kind of recourse by their user or anyone else.
So do you think changing Section 230 should still be part of the discussion, despite what seems to be a victory for free speech, most recently with Twitter being purchased by Elon Musk?
I do think, the reform efforts in Congress, Section 230 among them, need to continue. I do think that what Elon Musk is trying to do with Twitter is great, but unfortunately, I think altruistic billionaires are in short supply and not necessarily going to save us from all of the social media platforms that clearly have a problem with free speech. And at the end of the day, I think these platforms have developed from, just sort of small companies into massive behemoths that now control the entry points to our national discourse, and not to mention the marketplace itself. I'm thinking particularly of Facebook and Google in that regard. And, for candidates, for political speech, they are almost critical election infrastructure. So I think our public policy needs to respond to that. Part of that is Section 230, but I would even go further and suggest, potentially common carriage, should be considered, basically saying you have to admit all comers. That's something that's under consideration in the Senate, as well as robust antitrust enforcement. These companies, have gotten away with a lot, and it's been ironic to see people like former President Barack Obama say, "Oh, we need to police these platforms for misinformation," when under his tenure, they were almost immune from antitrust enforcement intentionally. So I do think that the reform efforts in Congress need to continue, despite what Elon Musk may be able to do with Twitter.
So we saw how quickly things changed with Twitter. It seemingly happened overnight. How do you think the heads of Google, Apple, Facebook, and other big tech companies are processing this?
I have to think they don't particularly like it. I think if Elon Musk is successful in his bid to transform Twitter into what he calls, more of a free speech company, it will put into stark relief the far more sort of censorious actions that Facebook and particularly Google take when it comes to content that they don't like. One thing that we've seen over the last several years is that these platforms have always acted in concert with one another. When Twitter banned the Hunter Biden story, so did Facebook. It was suppressed in Google search results. So they've always acted together. If Twitter acts independently and begins to allow more speech and more content, it is going to show Facebook and Google for what they are, which is already what we know, right? Which is sort of these ideologically censorious platforms.
Rachel, how big of an influence does social media have on elections and politics in general?
Well, I think it has a huge influence, and I think one that we can't even fully grapple with at this point. We've seen some targeted examples of it, when things like a story critical of a presidential campaign candidate's son was banned right before the presidential election. Polling shows that did have an impact on how voters viewed him. When a sitting president of the United States was kicked off a platform, he lost a critical access point to speak to the voters. You see this all the time, too, with political candidates who, their campaigns set aside money for Facebook advertising. You've heard Facebook say Donald Trump used our platform in ways we never even imagined to, when he ran in 2016, and that was part of what made his campaign successful. So I do think that, these platforms have opened up a huge avenue for candidates to speak directly to the voters, but that's not reflected in our laws. Our laws still say, well, there's no carve out for political speech on these platforms. These companies can ban whoever they want, which would be fine, except that they control, I think, very critical levers to our discourse. So if candidates are not able to access them, that's almost a thumb on the scale of an election at that point.
Rachel Bovard, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene is rolling out a Free Speech Act to abolish Section 230. Plus, what is she saying about Elon Musk's Twitter takeover, where her personal account still remains banned? NTD's Iris Tao has more.
I'll be definitely appealing for my Twitter account to be reinstated.
Standing beside a printout of her suspended Twitter account, Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene is introducing a bill to abolish Section 230.
Today, a small group of big tech firms facilitate the majority of the world's debate. They decide who sees what and who can speak.
Titled the 21st Century Free Speech Act, Greene's measure would eliminate Section 230, which protects online platforms from liability, including lawsuits over free speech. She says it would be replaced with a common carrier approach,
under which internet service providers can remove harmful content while ensuring access for everyone.
The announcement comes on the heel of Elon Musk's Twitter takeover, and Greene's inviting the Twitter boss-to-be to talk with her in Washington, D.C.
I'd be happy to put together a roundtable of all the most brilliant people who have been unjustly banned from Twitter, and he can see for himself the urgent necessity of doing right by them.
Greene's personal Twitter account was permanently suspended for violating the platform's misinformation policy, and critics are raising concerns about a further spread of misinformation following Musk's Twitter buyout. But Greene says,
I don't believe in this whole misinformation thing. That's people expressing their own views.
And the Congresswoman told NTD that it's not only her who's been targeted.
There's been many people, I think, I wouldn't even say we possibly know the number, who have had their accounts permanently banned and have been censored, and it's no accident.
And as for who will be invited to the proposed roundtable with Elon Musk, Greene said she's putting together a list of people who have been almost deleted from public life, such as Milo Yiannopoulos and Alex Jones. Reporting in Washington, D.C., Iris Tao, NTD News.
Nearly 400 employees at the CDC have not received a COVID-19 vaccine. That's according to data obtained by the Epoch Times from the Freedom of Information Act, a government agency that archives public records. An officer with the agency said that 382 workers at the CDC remain unvaccinated. Another 9 workers have only had 1 dose of the Pfizer or Moderna vaccines. The numbers make up approximately 3.2% of the CDC's workforce. The rest of the roughly 12,000 CDC employees have been vaccinated, and about 5,000 employees have shared that they have received the booster as well. Starting on May 15th, the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C. will no longer be requiring proof of vaccination at its performances, but masks will still be required for all patrons, regardless of vaccination status. Dr. Ben Carson was Secretary of Housing and Urban Development during the Trump administration. He was also the Director of Pediatric Neurosurgery at Johns Hopkins. Dr. Carson is the top-selling author of the new book, Created Equal. We're happy to have Dr. Carson on to join us. Dr. Ben Carson, thank you for joining us on the Capitol Report.
Absolutely, a pleasure always.
Dr. Carson, Dr. Fauci has just declared that the pandemic was over in a recent interview, and then the following day he seemed to have backtracked on that statement. What type of effect does this have from your medical perspective, sending out mixed messaging to the general public?
Well, the general public has lost so much confidence in the CDC and NIH at this stage because of all the flip-flopping. I don't know that it has much of an effect. Things are already in the toilet as far as confidence is concerned. And, we're going to have some real truth and some real transparency in order to get it back. It's not going to come back anytime soon.
If I could just switch gears a little bit and ask you about a recent report. Harvard University has just announced they'll establish a $100 million fund to research and redress its relationship to slavery from around the time of the 17th century. What are your thoughts on this initiative?
Well, if it's done in a truthful way, if we look at the real history, I don't have any problem with it. In our new book, Created Equal, we go into the history of slavery. That's an awful institution. But one thing that people must recognize is that it's been something that has plagued mankind throughout the history of mankind. As long as there's been written history, we've known about slavery. And so we're not unique in having had it. We are unique in being willing to fight a civil war and lose a large portion of our population to get rid of it. And I hope that that part is brought out. I hope it's also brought out that there were all kinds of slave owners in the United States. The vast majority of white people in the South did not own slaves, could not own slaves. Those were things for aristocrats. So to try to paint, a whole group of people because of the sins of some of the ancestors doesn't really make a lot of sense.
Doctor, you mentioned your book, Created Equal, subtitled The Painful Past, Confusing Present, and Hopeful Future of Race in America. When it comes to the confusing present, are you concerned that the manipulation of race has actually set us back?
There's no question it set us back. We've made enormous progress in this country in the area of race relations. When I was a child, it was a very different place than it is now. And when a black person came on television when I was a child and they were not in a servile role, it was a big deal. Everybody came to see it. And, now it's no big deal. In fact, now we have black admirals and generals and CEOs of Fortune 500 companies and presidents of universities, including Ivy League universities, heads of major foundations. We've had a black president elected twice, black vice president. I mean, to sit there and say that we haven't made enormous progress, all of that's happened just in my lifetime, that is absolute nonsense. Of course we've made great progress. Doesn't mean that nirvana has been reached. We still have a ways to go. But let's build our future on the tremendous progress that we've made and not build our future on the mistakes of the past.
Dr. Ben Carson, thank you for joining us.
Has been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
In recent testimony, the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation proposed revoking China's most favored nation trade status and strengthening democratic free market economies to reduce dependency on China. The think tank president told NTD that the U.S. has another problem: state and local governments subsidizing China.
So here we are trying to slow down China, but at the same time, the state and local governments are providing subsidies to speed up China.
According to watchdog Good Jobs First, states and localities provided close to $2 billion in subsidies to Chinese firms since 2010. The Aviation Industry Corporation of China received $168 million in subsidies. In 2020, the company was on the Pentagon's list of entities with ties to China's military.
Congress could pass a law that says if you would like to continue to receive federal funds, such as for highways, you can't give money to a Chinese firm. It would stop tomorrow.